I'm sure you already know a little bit about her at least, but who really was Elizabeth I? Born on the 7th of September 1533, Elizabeth was of course the daughter of Henry VIII with his second wife Anne Boleyn. Henry already had a daughter by his first wife Catherine of Aragon, and he of course kind of wanted Elizabeth to have been born a boy, after having turned the country upside down in his pursuit of Anne Boleyn in hopes of having a boy by her. But it was not meant to be, and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, was executed just 2 years later, leaving Elizabeth without a mother at a very young age. Elizabeth was therefore then removed from the line of succession to inherit the throne of England, and she was no longer deemed a princess. She was henceforth to be called the Lady Elizabeth. And following her mother's execution, Elizabeth was neglected by her father Henry VIII. Her childhood was a very lonely one, outside of London, away from the public eye, and though she was the daughter of a king, she did not have a princessly upbringing. However, a few years later, when Henry VIII had his precious son Edward VI by his third wife Jane Seymour, he was good enough to give Elizabeth a good education. But it wasn't until Henry married his sixth and final wife Catherine Parr that Elizabeth was welcomed back into the family. And though her relationship with her father was a very complicated one, Elizabeth is recorded to have wept intensely at his loss. Following Henry VIII's death, as we know, there was a tumultuous time for Elizabeth. Her brother Edward VI was king, and later on Mary I, and Elizabeth's name was involved in a lot of rebellions, which led to conflict between the sisters. Mary I, of course, being a Catholic queen, and Elizabeth being her Protestant heir. But finally, upon Mary I's death in 1558, it was Elizabeth's turn to inherit the throne of England, despite having been born by the great whore Anne Boleyn. Her coronation took place on the 15th of January 1559, and it was an impressive and expensive celebration. Elizabeth was a very clever and quick-witted ruler, and she rarely failed to get her own way. And she of course surrounded herself with carefully chosen ministers to help her rule. As she learned from her sister's reign before her, women were not deemed fit to rule. But she soon proved that she could be as cunning and ruthless as any king of England. And she soon proved to be a formidable leader. Elizabeth had a weakness for flattery, however, and she was very vain. And every single portrait she had done was very carefully inspected to make sure she looked her absolute best. I mean, fair enough. Over the years, of course, Elizabeth was very often encouraged to marry and produce a Protestant heir. But marriage and children was not on the cards for Elizabeth. No doubt having been traumatized from her father's many marriages and the way that he got rid of several of his wives, including her own mother. And though she received many marriage proposals, including one from Philip II of Spain, who had been her sister Mary I's husband, she very cleverly rejected them all. And in 1566, Parliament actually tried to force Elizabeth into a marriage by refusing to give her any more money until she married. But Elizabeth continued to refuse, eventually claiming that she did not need a husband, for she was already married to England. There was of course more to it than simply her wish not to marry due to perhaps childhood traumas. Marrying a prince of a foreign land would have diminished Elizabeth's own power, and therefore made England less powerful. Elizabeth, of course, reigned for 40-odd years, and in those years she faced many issues. One such issue being, of course, her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, being the granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, who was Henry VIII's sister, held a slight claim to the throne of England herself. And many at the time of Elizabeth's reign actually referred to her as the heretic queen, because many Catholics within England did not support her right to rule. And then when Mary, Queen of Scots suddenly arrived in England after having been made to abdicate the throne of Scotland, Elizabeth saw this as a threat to her reign. Though Mary, Queen of Scots only came to England in the hopes that Elizabeth would help her regain her throne in Scotland, Elizabeth could not trust this to be true, and Mary was consequently kept under house arrest for 19 years, in which time many rebellions and plots to assassinate Elizabeth ensued, in the hope of replacing Elizabeth with Mary, Queen of Scots as queen. Many of her advisors encouraged her to execute Mary, Queen of Scots, but of course this would have been regicide. Mary was her own cousin, and Elizabeth could not do that to her own flesh and blood. Not without cause, at least. For even though there were many assassination attempts on Elizabeth in Mary Queen of Scots' name, Mary Queen of Scots was never directly linked in the involvement of any of these plots. But in 1587, following a discovery of various letters written in code by Mary Queen of Scots herself, plotting yet again to assassinate Elizabeth, she was able to connect her directly to a plot. And with such damning evidence, there was no way to avoid it any longer. And Mary Queen of Scots was found guilty of treason and beheaded. Mary's execution, however, of course angered many Catholics in Europe. And the Pope encouraged King Philip II of Spain, remember the guy who wanted to marry Elizabeth, to invade England. Philip II of Spain did not really need that much persuasion because for many years already, Elizabeth had been antagonizing Spain, not only with the rejection of his proposal, but also with her involvement in the slave trade. For many years, Spain and Portugal had dominated the Atlantic Ocean and gaining riches from the Americas. But in the years following her coronation, Elizabeth decided that England could be profiting from this as well. And she ordered her pirateers to plunder the Spanish ships on their way back from the Americas. And for years, England was profiting from plundering the Spanish ships, whether it had been gold, slaves, whatever. So following Mary Queen of Scots' execution and the Pope's okay for Philip II of Spain to invade England, he was more than happy to. And this is of course when he sent his Spanish Armada. And in 1588, he sent a fleet of 130 ships to invade England. The English sent out their own fleet, of course, including 8 fire ships, which were burning ships sent out at random, and this led to the Spanish Armada having to split up and disperse. And Philip really did pick the greatest weekend to invade England because a storm then hit. And this led to a lot of the Spanish ships being wrecked. The Spanish Armada, of course, then retreated, and this is considered one of the greatest victories of Elizabeth's reign. But Elizabeth did retaliate, and she sent her own fleet to Spain, known as the English Armada. But much like the Spanish Armada in England, the English Armada in Spain was defeated quite pathetically. But we don't talk about that. Elizabeth's reign is looked back on as the golden age of British history. It was a time of great exploration by men like Sir Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh. Poetry, music, and literature flourished, and Elizabeth, being a lover of plays, opened the first theatres in London. But she was not hailed all over Britain. And in Ireland, she was actually referred to as Bloody Bess, due to her rather brutal ways in dealing with rebellions, where during the Desmond rebellions, Elizabeth ordered her men not only to deal with the rebels, but also to weaken the area by ordering civilians' homes to be burnt down, their livestock to be killed, and their crops to be destroyed, known as the Scorched Earth policy. And though this of course led to the end of the rebellion, this also led to 30,000 civilian deaths due to starvation. There was also a 9-year-long war between England and Ireland in the end of her reign, which of course led to thousands more deaths, including again civilians. By the early 1600s, Elizabeth's health had deteriorated quite a lot. Many of her counsellors, as well as her favourite Robert Dudley, had died by this point, and she was not only old and frail, but also very sad by many losses. She was balding, she had bad teeth due to her love of sugar, and on the 24th of March 1603, Elizabeth finally breathed her last, having reigned for 44 years, which at that time in history had been the longest reign ever. If you want to find out more, read my book, The Haunted Queen.